For decades, people believed they already knew the story of James Bolam and Rodney Bewes, two men who seemed inseparable on screen, yet somehow ended up not speaking for nearly 40 years. After Rodney Bewes passed away, the silence between them suddenly became louder than ever, with headlines suggesting bitterness, betrayal, even a lifelong feud. But when James Bolam finally broke that silence, what he said didn't match the story people had been repeating for years. And that raises a far more uncomfortable question. What really happened between them? The friendship that looked real, and why people believed it. The story begins with two actors who, to the public, never seemed like just co-stars. James Bolam and Rodney Bewes became household names through The Likely Lads, a show built entirely around the dynamic between two working-class friends navigating everyday life. What made the series so effective wasn't just the writing, but the rhythm between the two leads. Their timing, their reactions, and the way they played off each other created something that felt natural, almost effortless. Off-screen, at least in the early years, that connection appeared to extend beyond the set. During the original run of the show, Bolam and Bewes did spend time together outside of work. They would go out for meals with their wives, talk through scripts, and build a working relationship that seemed stable and cooperative. It wasn't the kind of loud, demonstrative friendship that drew attention, but it was enough to convince those around them that the bond was real. That belief only strengthened when the show returned years later as Whatever Happened to the Likely Lads. Audiences saw the same chemistry, the same emotional familiarity, and assumed nothing had changed. If anything, the passage of time seemed to add depth to their performances, making the relationship between their characters feel even more lived in. For viewers, it reinforced a simple idea. These two men understood each other both on and off screen, but behind that perception, there were already signs that the reality was more complicated. Even in those early years, the two men approached their careers and their lives very differently. Bolam was known for being reserved, careful about what he shared, and protective of his private life. He treated acting as a profession, something to be done well and then left behind when the workday ended. Bewes, on the other hand, was far more open, more talkative, and far more comfortable turning personal experiences into stories for others to hear. At first, those differences didn't seem to matter. In fact, they may have even contributed to the balance that made their performances so compelling. But over time, what had once been complementary began to feel incompatible. The same traits that made them effective partners on screen started to create distance off-screen, slowly reshaping a working relationship that had once seemed solid into something far more fragile. And that growing tension would eventually reach a point where one moment, one story, would change everything, even if, later on, one of them would insist that it never really did. The story that went too far. And the phone call that ended everything. By the time the turning point came, the relationship between James Bolam and Rodney Bewes was already carrying quiet tension beneath the surface. They were still working together, still delivering performances that convinced millions, but off-screen, the differences in how they viewed privacy, professionalism, and personal boundaries had become harder to ignore. The moment that would later be blamed for everything came from something that, on its own, seemed harmless. During a press interview, Rodney Bewes shared an anecdote involving Bolam's partner, actress Susan Jameson. At the time, Bewes' own wife had just given birth to triplets, and during a car journey, Jameson had made a light remark comparing the situation, saying that while Bewes' household had suddenly expanded by 3 children, she herself was expecting just 1. It was presented as a simple human moment, something amusing, something relatable, something Bewes believed was safe to repeat. From his perspective, it wasn't a betrayal. He later insisted it was a nice story, not something malicious, and even claimed that Bolam had laughed about it when it was first shared privately. But the context changed the moment it appeared in print. What had once been a private exchange was now public information, and for someone like Bolam, who had always drawn a strict line between his professional life and his personal life, that shift mattered. Realizing too late what he had done, Bewes tried to fix it. He picked up the phone and called Bolam to explain himself, to apologize, and to clarify that no harm had been intended. According to Bewes's own account, the conversation did not go the way he hoped. Bolam listened in silence, offered no reassurance, and then abruptly ended the call. After that, there was no follow-up, no attempt to revisit the conversation, no gradual repair of the situation. The line went quiet and stayed that way. What makes this moment so significant is not just what was said, but what followed. That phone call became, in many retellings, the definitive break, the point at which a friendship ended. It was simple, easy to understand, and easy for the media to repeat. One actor revealed something private, the other took offense, and the relationship collapsed instantly. But even at the time, that explanation was incomplete. The silence that followed was too absolute, too long-lasting to be explained by a single anecdote alone. It suggests something deeper, something that had been building long before that interview ever took place. And yet, for years, that one moment became the official version of events. It was the story people told because it made sense. It had a clear cause, a clear reaction, and a clear outcome. What it didn't have was the full truth, and that would only begin to emerge much later, when the distance between the two men had already stretched across decades. 4 decades of silence, and the story that kept changing. After that phone call, something far more significant than a disagreement took hold. It wasn't anger, it wasn't confrontation, it was absence. James Bolam did not publicly attack Rodney Bewes. He did not respond in interviews, and he did not offer any explanation at all. Instead, he did something much more definitive. He simply moved on and never looked back. That decision created a vacuum, and over time, that vacuum was filled almost entirely by one voice, Bewes himself. For years, he continued to speak about the situation in interviews, gradually shaping a narrative that the public would come to accept as fact. In his version, the relationship had been close, the fallout sudden, and the consequences deeply personal. He described the silence as painful, something he didn't fully understand and never managed to repair. At first, he tried to soften the situation. In some interviews, he suggested that they were still in occasional contact, mentioning supposed meetings or casual encounters. But those claims didn't hold up over time, and eventually, he began to admit that the silence was real and long-standing. By then, the story had already taken on a life of its own. What made things more complicated was how Bewes connected that silence to his own later struggles. As his career slowed and opportunities became less frequent, he began to point to external factors that he believed had worked against him. One of the most repeated claims was that James Bolam had refused to allow repeats of The Likely Lads and its sequel, effectively limiting the income that could have come from those broadcasts. Bewes argued that each episode could have generated around £4,000 in fees, money that, in his situation, would have made a significant difference. He described his financial reality in stark terms. By his 70s, he still had a mortgage, an overdraft, and was relying heavily on touring one-man shows to stay afloat. These weren't large productions backed by major networks. They were smaller performances that required him to handle much of the logistics himself. He spoke openly about driving across the country, managing equipment, and taking on responsibilities that went far beyond acting, all while watching his former co-star continue to secure steady television work. That contrast only deepened the narrative. On one side, there was an actor who seemed to have moved seamlessly from one successful project to another, building a stable and visible career. On the other, there was someone who had never quite been able to recreate the same level of recognition, and who now linked part of that outcome to decisions he believed were out of his control. But even as those claims spread, there were inconsistencies that often went unchallenged. Records showed that episodes of both series had, in fact, been repeated multiple times across different channels over the years. The idea that they had been completely blocked didn't align with the actual broadcast history. Yet the narrative persisted, largely because it was compelling. It added motive, conflict, and a sense of injustice to a story that otherwise might have seemed too quiet. Meanwhile, Bolam remained silent. He did not correct the record, did not respond to the accusations, and did not engage with the growing speculation. That silence, intended as distance, ended up reinforcing the mystery. With only one side speaking, the story continued to evolve, becoming more defined, more dramatic, and more widely accepted with each passing year. And by the time the truth was finally addressed, the version most people believed had already been shaped by decades of repetition. Not a single incident, but years of incompatibility. By the time the public had settled on a simple explanation for what happened between James Bolam and Rodney Bewes, the real story had already become far more layered than a single mistake or a single moment. The idea that everything collapsed because of one anecdote was easy to understand, but it overlooked something much more fundamental, the fact that the two men had never truly been aligned in the first place. Even during the earliest days of The Likely Lads, when the show was building its success, those differences were already visible to people working around them. Bolam approached acting as a craft that required focus, discipline, and above all, separation from personal life. He was known to come onto set, deliver what was needed, and leave without seeking attention or social interaction beyond what was necessary. He avoided publicity whenever possible and rarely spoke about anything unrelated to the work itself. Bewes operated in almost the opposite way. He was energetic, talkative, and deeply immersed in the culture of performance, not just on stage but in everyday life. He enjoyed telling stories, expanding on them, and turning ordinary experiences into entertaining material. That quality made him engaging in interviews and social settings, but it also meant that boundaries, especially the kind Bolam valued, were often blurred. This contrast didn't immediately create conflict, but it did create friction. Over time, that friction became more noticeable, particularly during the production of Whatever Happened to the Likely Lads. While the scripts were strong and the performances remained convincing, those working on the show began to sense that the atmosphere behind the scenes was not as relaxed as it appeared on screen. Accounts from colleagues later described an environment where both actors remained professional but were not at ease with each other. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public argument, and no explosive moment that forced a separation. Instead, there was a steady underlying tension that never fully surfaced, but never disappeared either. One co-star recalled feeling caught in the middle, aware that something was off, but unsure how to address it. Bolam dealt with this by narrowing his focus even further. He concentrated on delivering consistent performances and avoided engaging in anything that might prolong interaction beyond the immediate needs of filming. When necessary, he would acknowledge strong work from Bewes, but he kept those exchanges brief and contained. It was a controlled, deliberate way of maintaining distance while still fulfilling his role. Bewes, meanwhile, continued to engage with the broader experience of the show, interviews, publicity, and social interactions that extended beyond the set. In doing so, he often presented the partnership as harmonious, reinforcing the image that audiences already believed. That public narrative, however, did not reflect the reality of how the relationship was functioning internally. What James Bolam said after Rodney Bewes died, and why it changed the story. When Rodney Bewes died in November, the old story resurfaced immediately. For years, the public had heard one version of events more than any other. Two beloved co-stars had fallen out, never reconciled, and carried that bitterness to the end. Because James Bolam had stayed silent for so long, That version had hardened into something close to accepted truth. It was only after Bewes was gone that Bolam finally addressed it directly, and what he said forced people to look at the whole story differently. Speaking in a brief radio interview, Bolam rejected the idea that there had been some dramatic feud. He said there had been no fallout at all, as far as I was concerned, and described their relationship in much more practical terms. They had worked together happily, enjoyed each other's company, and then, when the work ended, life moved on. He explained that this was simply how acting worked. People came together intensely for a job, got to know one another well, and then went off into other projects, other circles, and other routines. In his view, the public had mistaken professional closeness for a lifelong personal bond. That response mattered because it did not sound like the reaction of a man reopening an old wound. It sounded like someone refusing the dramatic version altogether. Bolam did express sadness at Bewes's death and said his thoughts were with the family, but he framed his memories around the good times they had while making the show. He did not revisit old complaints. He did not defend himself point by point. He did not attack Bewes for the years of public accusations. Instead, he reduced the myth to something smaller, colder, and in some ways more believable. They worked together, they worked well, and then they drifted apart. He also pushed back against one of the most repeated allegations, the idea that he had personally blocked repeats of the old programs. Bolam's response was blunt. He said he had no power to stop repeats and added that he himself was paid when they were shown, which made the accusation even less logical from his point of view. That mattered because, for years, this claim had helped keep the feud narrative alive. It had turned a personal estrangement into an accusation of active cruelty. But once that claim was questioned, the emotional balance of the story shifted. What emerges from Bolam's late response is not innocence in the sentimental sense, but distance in the literal one. He was never claiming that he and Bewes remained close. He was saying something almost harsher than that. The relationship simply did not mean to him what the public, and perhaps Bewes himself, wanted it to mean. That is what makes the ending of this story so uncomfortable. It is not the story of two men locked in open hatred. It is the story of one man continuing to grieve a connection, while the other had emotionally left it behind a very long time ago. And perhaps that is why the rumors lasted so long. People prefer betrayal to indifference, because betrayal at least suggests that something powerful once existed. But in the end, the clearest explanation may be the simplest one Rodney Bewes himself eventually stumbled into when he said they were different animals. That line cuts through everything else. It explains the tension, the silence, the conflicting memories, and the decades of misunderstanding better than any headline ever did. So what do you think was really more damaging here? That press interview, or the fact that James Bolam and Rodney Bewes were simply too different to stay close for long? Leave your answer in the comments, and subscribe for more stories behind the partnerships that looked perfect on screen but were far more complicated in real life.